The chime was the loneliest sound in the universe. A single, synthetic bell tone that signified the end of a micro-jump and the start of another mind-numbing glide across the void. For 5 years, it had been the punctuation mark in the endless run-on sentence of my life. Chime, glide, chime. The Stardust Drifter, my rickety intra-station ferry, hummed its usual discordant tune. The thrum of the recycler, the low whine of the grav plates, the whisper of the ventilation. It was the only orchestra I ever listened to, the soundtrack to a life spent hauling cargo containers and the occasional silent passenger between the glittering, distant habitats that spangled the inner skin of the Dyson sphere. Another 5 hours to Habitat Epsilon 9. Another crate of nutrient paste and hydrocoils. Another entry in a log no one would ever read. I sipped the lukewarm, metallic-tasting coffee from my bulb and watched the cosmos drift by the main viewport. It wasn't the majestic tapestry poets wrote about. Out here, in the engineered twilight between the great city plates, it was just empty. A deep, sterile blackness punctuated by the artificial constellations of human hives. I saw the people inside them as data points on my manifest, names and destinations. They had lives, families, loves, and feuds. I had the chime and the hum. My fingers traced the worn grooves in the console, a topography of boredom. I knew every scratch, every flickering light. The drifter was less a machine and more a prosthetic extension of myself, and we were both wearing down. Sometimes, floating out here, I'd imagine my own thoughts stretching out from the hull, thinning into nothing. A tempting idea, a quiet end to the quiet hum. Loneliness wasn't a visitor, it was the cabin's atmosphere, and I'd long ago learned to breathe it. That's when it happened. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. A violent tectonic shudder that came from the ship's very bones. My coffee bulb flew from my grasp, spraying a brown nebula across the viewport. I was thrown hard against my restraints as the ferry twisted with a groan of tortured metal. A high-pitched, calamitous scream erupted from the drive core, a sound like a star being torn apart. Then the alarms began their frantic, shrieking chorus, a symphony of failure. Red lights flashed across the console, painting my face in the color of crisis. Core containment failure. Drive offline. Life support critical. I ripped my hands free from the harness, my mind snapping into the cold, sharp focus of training. Years of simulation drills took over, my panic locked away in a small, tight box. My fingers flew over the controls, trying to isolate the cascade failure, to reroute auxiliary power, to do something. But every screen I brought up was a cascade of error messages, a waterfall of red text that all said the same thing: dead. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The keening whine of the dying drive spooled down into a pathetic whimper. The alarms cut out one by one as their parent systems flatlined. The thrum of the recycler, gone. The whisper of the vents, gone. The humming orchestra was silenced. All of it. In its place was a silence so absolute, so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear the wet thump of my own heart, the thin, reedy sound of my breath fogging the cold plasteel. The silence was not empty. It felt dense, ancient. Outside the viewport, the distant lights of Epsilon 9 and the habitat I'd left behind glowed like unreachable heavens. I was floating in a dead ship, in a dead patch of space, a tiny mote of failed technology suspended in an abyss. The chime was gone. There was only the silence. And for the first time in years, the loneliness had a voice, and it was screaming. The truth is what she was hiding, was only just beginning. Panic is a corrosive acid. The training teaches you to contain it, to build a dam of procedure and checklist against the flood. My hands, slick with sweat, moved with a practiced precision that belied the frantic thrumming in my chest. First things first, diagnostics. The emergency power was holding, just barely, feeding the main console and a few essential systems. The ship's diagnostic VI, a dry, emotionless voice I usually found grating, was now a welcome presence. Run Level 1 Deep Diagnostic, primary drive and power conduits, I ordered, my own voice sounding thin and alien in the tomb-like quiet. Processing. The console display blinked. Seconds stretched into an eternity. My gaze kept flicking to the viewport, to the impossibly distant jewels of the habitats. They weren't getting any closer. They were static, painted on the black canvas. I was a bug, trapped in amber. Diagnostic complete. The screen flashed. Results: catastrophic failure in primary drive coil. Inverter cascade burnout. Estimated repair requirements: full shipyard overhaul. The words hung there. A death sentence written in calm, clinical text. Full shipyard overhaul. That meant there was nothing I could do from this chair. Nothing my toolkit or my training could fix. The acid of panic began to seep through the dam. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat in the oppressive silence. Okay, fine, I couldn't fix the ship. Plan B, call for help. I flicked the comms panel on, the screen glowing a hopeful green. I routed the distress call to the primary habitat band, the one constantly monitored by every station, every ship, every lonely outpost in the sphere. My finger hovered over the transmit button. I took a deep, shaky breath, composing the words. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is ferry ship Stardust Drifter, registration 779er Kilo, experiencing total drive failure. I pressed the transmit key. Instead of the familiar chirp of a signal sent, the speakers erupted with a sound that clawed at the edges of my sanity. It was static, but it wasn't the clean, white noise hiss of an empty channel. This was thick, wet, and guttural. It sounded like grinding rocks, like something gargling fluid in the back of its throat. It was a physical presence, a sound with texture and weight. It filled the small cabin, pressing in on my eardrums, vibrating through the deck plates. I recoiled, yanking my finger back as if burned. The noise stopped instantly, plunging me back into the suffocating silence. "What the hell?" I whispered. My professional composure was a cracked shell, and the thing inside it was starting to feel very small. I tried again. Subspace comms, long-range, tight beam, even the antiquated laser pulse system. Each attempt yielded the same result, The moment I tried to send a signal, a cry for help, a whisper of my existence, the void responded with that drowning, devouring roar. It wasn't just blocking my signal, it felt like it was eating it, like the very act of reaching out was an offense that drew its ire. All my training, all the years of calm, methodical problem-solving were useless. My emergency procedures were built on a single fundamental assumption, that if you called for help, someone might hear you. But out here, my voice was being strangled before it could even form a word. The dam of procedure finally broke and the acid flooded through. The sterile, indifferent void I'd flown through 1,000 times no longer felt empty. It felt actively, malevolently hostile. It wasn't that no one could hear me. It was that something was making sure I couldn't be heard. The silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was the sound of a cage. The voice was all coming. My last hope was an antique, a holdover from an era before reliable subspace comms. The long-range signal flare. It was a glorified firework, a chemical stick that burned with the fury of a captured sliver of sun, designed to be seen across millions of kilometers. The drifter only had one. It was heavy in my hands, a cold metal cylinder that felt both substantial and pathetically inadequate. Hope had a physical weight, and it wasn't very heavy at all. I went through the launch sequence manually, bypassing the automated systems that the comms panel now refused to touch. The loading tube clunked into place, a solid, reassuring sound in the dead quiet of the ship. My fingers trembled slightly as I keyed in the arming code. All I needed was one patrol ship, one freighter captain with his eyes on the right patch of black at the right time. A single flare was a desperate, 1 in a million shot, but it was better than the 0 in a million chance the comms were giving me. "Okay, you son of a bitch," I muttered to the static, to the void, to whatever was listening. "Try and eat this." With a grim finality, I slammed my palm onto the launch stud. There was a low thump as the compressed gas charge ignited and the flare shot from its housing. I pressed my face to the viewport, my breath fogging the plasteel, my heart seizing in my chest. For a glorious, beautiful second, it worked. A brilliant streak of crimson fire tore through the black, a violent scratch against the perfect darkness. It was a defiant shout made of light, my own personal star screaming my existence into the void. It traveled 100 meters, then 200, a blazing testament to my refusal to simply vanish. I followed its progress, a knot of raw hope tightening in my gut. "See me, please, somebody, see me." Then it just stopped. It didn't fade, it didn't burn out. One moment the flare was there, a vibrant, burning spear of magnesium-red hope. The next, it was gone, utterly and completely gone. It was as if someone had snipped a single frame out of the film of reality. The light was there, and then it wasn't. There was no fizzle, no dissipating smoke, no fading afterglow. The blackness simply reclaimed its territory instantly and perfectly. It was the most unnatural thing I had ever seen. I stared, unblinking, at the patch of space where my signal had been. My mind struggled to process the sheer impossibility of it. Light doesn't just stop. It travels until it hits something or its energy dissipates over vast distances. It doesn't just get erased. A cold dread, far deeper and more chilling than simple fear, crept up my spine and coiled at the base of my skull. This wasn't a systems failure. This wasn't some strange pocket of radiation or a previously unknown stellar phenomenon. This was a violation of physics. This was an active, deliberate act of negation. Something out there didn't just want me to be quiet. It wanted me to be unseen. I pushed myself away from the viewport, stumbling back until the rear of the cockpit pressed against my back. The distant, mocking lights of the habitats seemed to dim, their promise of salvation fading. The ship was a tomb. The comms were useless. And now I understood with a terrifying certainty that even light itself could not escape this place. My isolation wasn't a state of being. It was a cage whose walls were made of impossible physics. I wasn't just lost. I was being hiding. And whatever was hiding me was still out there, watching in the dark. The voice was beginning with a slight touch of emptiness. Desperation is a key. It unlocks doors you're never meant to open. My own systems were a dead end, but the ship itself, the ship had a memory. Every ferry kept deep archives, black box-style data logs of every flight, every system fluctuation. But there were deeper layers, maintenance-level archives that recorded passage through charted and uncharted space, tagging spatial anomalies and radiation fluctuations. Accessing them was against every company regulation, a mess of override commands and safeties that could brick the entire nav computer. Right now, I couldn't care less. I needed an answer. I needed to know what this place was. My fingers flew across the emergency console, typing in the manual overrides. Warnings flashed in angry red letters. Unauthorized access. Proceeding may cause system instability. I hit confirm without a second thought. The screen flickered and resolved into a raw data directory, a long list of file names and timestamps. I filtered for this specific sector, a block of space designated on the charts as a navigational dead zone, avoidable but not forbidden. There were only a handful of entries, most of them automated deep space probe readings from decades ago. All of them were unremarkable. Then I saw it. One file, dated 12 years prior. Vessel designation, Survey Ship Scythe. Its status was listed as lost, presumed destroyed. My blood ran cold. The Scythe was a ghost story pilots told on long hauls, a state-of-the-art explorer that had vanished without a trace on its maiden voyage. And its last recorded data packet came from right here. I opened the log. Most of it was corrupted, chunks of data missing or degraded into digital noise. But what remained was horrifyingly coherent. I scrolled through fragmented sensor readings. Anomalous gravitational lensing detected. 0-point energy fluctuations exceeding known theoretical limits. High-frequency EM field with no discernible source. Standard explorership jargon, but the readings were off the charts. Impossible numbers, followed by strings of question marks. Then came the audio logs from the crew. They were just as fractured. The first few entries were from a geologist, her voice laced with scientific excitement. Not an echo. The resonance is synchronous. It's almost as if the space itself is listening, responding to our sensor pings with a perfect, instantaneous mimicry. The next entry was from the ship's psychologist, his voice strained, tight with worry. Auditory pareidolia reported in 12 crew members. They're hearing patterns in the ship's ambient noise. Music, voices. The medbay is getting crowded. I'm starting to hear it myself, a kind of humming. The geologist again, her voice no longer excited, but hushed and fearful. It's not mimicking our scans anymore. It's anticipating them. The patterns are getting more complex. One of the junior techs started humming along with it, said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. We had to sedate him. My own heart was pounding in my ears, a frantic counter-rhythm to the dead silence of my own ship. I felt a phantom vibration under my feet, my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe not. I scrolled frantically to the final entry. It was from the captain. His voice was a raw, terrified rasp, a man screaming into a recorder as his world ended. The audio was distorted, shot through with the same grinding, gargling static that had swallowed my own distress calls. But through the noise, I could make out his words. "It's in the ship. It's in our heads. It sings of completion, a promise, an end to... Don't listen. For God's sake, don't listen. Don't..." The log ended there, abruptly, just like my flare. The words echoed in the profound silence of the cockpit. It sings of completion. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the console. I slammed the archive shut, plunging the screen back into darkness, but I couldn't erase the words from my mind. The survey ship Scythe hadn't been destroyed by a meteor or a drive failure. It had been talked to death. And I was floating in the exact same spot, in a dead ship, with the volume turned all the way down, waiting for the performance to begin. The silence after I closed the Scythe's log was different. It was no longer empty. It was expectant, a held breath. I found myself straining my ears, listening for something I desperately did not want to hear. My own breathing was a roaring intrusion, my heartbeat a frantic war drum. Every creak of the cooling ship frame, every tick of a contracting pipe made me jump. I was a rat in a tin can, and something was starting to tap on the lid. And then it began. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a vibration, a subtle resonance that seemed to travel up from the deck plates into the soles of my feet, humming in my teeth. It was the faintest of whispers, just at the edge of hearing, like a voice in the next room. I thought it was the vents, the recycler trying to kick back on. Auditory pareidolia, the log had said. My mind was manufacturing patterns from random noise. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms into them. Get a grip, Elias. You're just spooked. Elias. My eyes snapped open. The voice was clearer now. It hadn't come from the vents. It had come from inside my own skull. It was soft, melodic, and impossibly gentle. It was a voice that felt like a warm blanket, like the memory of a kindness I'd never actually received. So alone, Elias. I scrambled out of my chair, a raw cry catching in my throat. I looked wildly around the cockpit. The small space was empty, filled with nothing but shadows and the cold, indifferent lights of the dead console. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The silence was my only answer, but the voice wasn't gone. It had just sunk deeper. It wasn't an intruder to be repelled. It felt like one of my own thoughts, only it wasn't mine. "All that space between people," it whispered, its tone one of deep, profound sympathy. "A void no ship can cross. You drift from port to port, a ghost delivering parcels to the living. But you don't have to be alone anymore." It knew. Somehow, it knew the deep, hollow ache that had been my constant companion for years. It wasn't just my name it had plucked from my mind. It had seen the shape of my soul. The loneliness I'd mistaken for an atmosphere was, to this thing, an open door. Its words weren't a threat. They were a seduction, a promise. It spoke of an end to the endless drifting, an end to the empty chair and the solitary cup of coffee. It sang of connection, of merging, of becoming part of something larger than myself. "We can be one," it hummed, the sound resonating in my bones. No more silence, no more space between. Just completion. The captain of the scythe had been right. It sang of completion. And damn him, damn all of them. It was the most beautiful, tempting song I had ever heard. A part of me, the part that had stared into the blackness for years and felt a kinship with its emptiness, wanted to give in. It wanted to listen. With a monumental effort of will, I tore my gaze from the inside of my own head and looked towards the main viewport. I expected to see a monster, a thing of tentacles and eyes, but there was nothing, only the star-dusted black. But it wasn't right. One patch of space directly ahead of the drifter seemed wrong. The light from the distant habitats bent slightly around its edges, as if I were looking through a flaw in the glass. The blackness there was deeper, more absolute. It didn't reflect light, it drank it. And as I stared, I saw it ripple, a slow, predatory undulation like the flank of some great, unseen beast. It wasn't just a patch of space. It was a mouth, and it was watching me, waiting. They're closer, they're on it, and this time, all of us are watching. The whisper in my head intensified, a sweet poison promising release. It's so simple, Elias. Just one moment of letting go, one step, and the loneliness ends forever. I stumbled backwards, away from the watching void at the window, my hands pressed to my temples as if I could physically block the voice out. My mind raced, clawing for an escape, for a weapon, for anything. The scythe's log, my useless comms, the extinguished flare, every path led to a dead end. Then, a flicker of memory, a cargo manifest, my last run to Epsilon 9. Item 7, destination, the psych ward at Epsilon's orbital hospital. Designation, Kresh Kardashev Type 3 psionic field emitter. They called it a Sci-shield, a high-tech device designed to create a small, localized zone of psychic silence for telepathically sensitive patients, shielding them from the constant background chatter of a crowded habitat. It was an experimental, ridiculously expensive piece of equipment, and it was sitting in my cargo hold. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through the fog of terror. "No," I snarled at the voice in my head. "Get out." I scrambled from the cockpit, moving through the narrow corridor that led to the small cargo bay. The ship was eerily quiet, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The voice followed me, its tone shifting from seductive to chiding. "Running, Elias? You can't run from yourself. We are already so close." I ignored it. My entire focus narrowed to a single point: the crate. It was strapped to the deck plating, a large gray container stenciled with biohazard warnings and fragile handling icons. I fumbled with the magnetic locks, my fingers clumsy and shaking. The clasps flew open, and I tore the lid off. Inside, nestled in thick foam padding, was the emitter. It looked innocuous enough, a metallic sphere about the size of my head, studded with crystalline conduits and a single glowing power switch. Its own independent power cell, the manifest had said. Good for 72 hours of continuous operation. "Don't do it, Elias," the voice soothed, a coiling serpent of sound in my mind. "It will only make the silence worse when it returns. Let me in. Let it be over." "Shut up," I gasped, hefting the heavy sphere from its cradle. It was surprisingly dense. I carried it back to the cockpit, every step an act of war against the entity's psychic pressure. I placed it in the co-pilot's chair, the only other seat in my tiny universe. My hand hovered over the activation switch. This was it, a 50-50 shot. Either it worked, or it was just a useless piece of medical tech that did nothing. With a final, ragged breath, I flicked the switch. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the sphere emitted a low, almost subsonic hum. The crystalline conduits pulsed with a soft blue light, casting strange geometric shadows across the cockpit. And the voice was gone. Not faded, not muffled, gone. Instantly, as if a switch had been flipped in my brain. The oppressive, watchful presence that had been pressing in on the hull vanished. The psychic weight was lifted. My own thoughts, frantic and loud just a moment ago, were suddenly mine again, clear and sharp. The air in the cockpit felt lighter, cleaner. The silence returned, but it was the old silence. The familiar, empty silence of a dead ship, not the predatory, listening silence of the entity. I sagged against the console, limp with relief. My legs gave out, and I slid to the floor, laughing a breathless, borderline hysterical laugh. It worked. The damned thing actually worked. The metal sphere hummed its quiet, protective song, a ward against the darkness. The ship was still dead. I was still stranded, but the cockpit had become a sanctuary, a fortress. For the first time since that first violent shudder, I felt safe. I had a weapon. I had a shield. All I had to do was sit inside my tiny circle of blue light and wait. Sooner or later, a patrol would notice a ferry off its route. Sooner or later, someone would come. I had bought myself time. I had a room of my own in the heart of the void, and the monster was locked outside. For an hour, I basked in the sterile quiet provided by the Psi shield. The blue glow of the emitter was a comforting campfire in the encroaching dark. I allowed my frayed nerves to settle, the adrenaline to recede. My thoughts were my own, and the solitude was a comfort, not a curse. I ran a low-power systems check, hoping that some miracle had occurred, but the drive was still a tomb of fried circuits. It didn't matter. I had 72 hours of power in the shield. The emergency life support had at least a week of breathable air. I could outlast this. Hope, which had been so brutally extinguished, rekindled itself as a small, stubborn flame. I was pulling a nutrient bar from my emergency locker when the first alarm blared through the cockpit. It was a jarring, ugly sound that ripped through my newfound peace. A piercing shriek accompanied by a flashing amber light on the life support panel. I dropped the ration bar and lunged for the console. Oxygen recycler, power draw exceeds safe limits. "What?" I muttered, my heart starting its frantic, familiar dance against my ribs. "How?" The recyclers were on a dedicated circuit, drawing from the main emergency batteries. They should have been fine for days. I pulled up the power distribution schematic, and my blood turned to ice. A thick, red line of energy drain snaked from the life support systems, but it wasn't going to the recyclers. It was being diverted, pulled away by a massive, unidentified power sink located right here, in the cockpit. My eyes snapped to the Psi shield humming contentedly in the co-pilot's chair. It was impossible. The device had its own independent power cell. The manifest was explicit. It shouldn't have been connected to the ship's systems in any way. But the schematic didn't lie. The shield was not just creating a psychic null zone, it was actively fighting the entity, and the fight was costing an astronomical amount of energy. To get it, the emitter had somehow reached into my ship. It had bypassed circuits and safeties, sinking parasitic, invisible tendrils into my life support system, the one thing keeping me alive. It was drinking my ship's power, drinking my air, to fuel my sanctuary. Another alarm joined the first, this one a deeper, more ominous klaxon. CO2 levels rising, cabin atmosphere integrity compromised. The air was already starting to feel thick, heavy in my lungs. I was suffocating. The sanctuary was a trap. Of course, I thought, a wave of bitter, hopeless irony washing over me. The entity wasn't a brute, it was intelligent. It had watched me find the shield. It had let me activate it. It had let me feel safe. It knew I had just traded a quick death for a slow one. The voice didn't need to be in my head anymore. Its trap was purely physical now. A beautiful, perfect dilemma. I could leave the shield on and slowly choke to death in my protected bubble of silence. Or I could turn it off, get my air back, and let the monster in to feast on my mind. Suffocation or madness? My fortress or my lungs? My breaths were coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A pressure was building behind my eyes, my thoughts growing fuzzy at the edges. I stumbled toward the co-pilot's chair, my hand outstretched. The soft blue light felt mocking now, a beacon of false hope. My lungs burned. Every cell in my body screamed for oxygen. This was no choice at all. There was no victory in dying for a few more hours of quiet. With the last of my clear thoughts, my fingers closed around the emitter's power switch. I clicked it off. The blue light died. The hum vanished. For a single, perfect heartbeat, there was only the blare of the failing life support alarms. And then the voice returned, not as a whisper, but as a triumphant, deafening chorus inside my skull. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a multitude, a choir of all the souls it had consumed, the crew of the scythe among them. Welcome back, Elias. We were beginning to feel so alone without you. The return of the voices was an avalanche. It wasn't a negotiation now, it was a conquest. The chorus of the damned screamed and whispered and sang in my head, a cacophony of promises and pleadings. They showed me memories that weren't mine, the terror of the Scythe's bridge crew as the bulkheads rippled, the quiet despair of 1,000 other lost souls who had drifted into this cosmic spiderweb. Overlaid on it all was the core consciousness of the entity, a vast, ancient hunger that promised me peace, the final peace of dissolution. You see, it boomed, a voice made of 100 voices. There is no escape. The ship is a tomb. The silence is a lie. Your body is a cage, Elias, so heavy, so fragile. Open the door. Let go. Join the song. We will be complete. My hand drifted towards the main airlock control panel on the bulkhead. Just a single button. That's all it would take. But as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a spark of something hard and jagged ignited in the deepest part of my soul. It was rage, a pure, defiant fury. I had spent my life defined by isolation, a quiet man in a quiet box. I would not let my death be a quiet surrender. I would not become another anonymous voice in its ghastly choir. If this thing wanted me, it would have to take me, and I would make sure it choke on the meal. An idea born of spite and desperation took shape in my mind, a suicidal, glorious, terrible idea. I wouldn't just be consumed passively. I would be the bait in a trap of my own making. I lurched away from the airlock controls, the entity's chorus roaring in protest and confusion in my mind. What are you doing? The path is here, the release. I ignored it, staggering back to the main engineering console behind my pilot's chair. My hands flew over the controls, no longer trembling with fear, but steady with a cold, absolute purpose. I wasn't trying to fix the ship anymore. I was preparing to unmake it. The Stardust Drifter ran on a microfusion core. It was a tiny, controlled star, powerful enough to punch a hole in space-time for a jump, stable enough to run for a century without refueling. But like any star, it could be made to go nova. Every core had an emergency purge sequence, a way to jettison the core in case of a catastrophic meltdown. And every emergency purge sequence could be bypassed. The safeties could be overridden. The containment fields could be deliberately, catastrophically collapsed. I brought up the core management screen. Override after override, warning after warning filled the display. Core containment field integrating compromised. Magnetic bottle instability detected. Immediate ejection recommended. I disabled the ejection system. Fatal meltdown imminent. I rerouted the final overload command, not to an automated timer, but to a manual trigger. A simple, physical button on the airlock control panel, right next to the one that would open the outer door. One final defiant act. It wouldn't be enough to just die. I had to grant the entity its wish, on my terms. I would offer myself up, a willing sacrifice, and when it came to claim its prize, I would light a fire bright enough to burn even a shadow that lived between the stars. The ship would become a bomb, and my consciousness, the very thing it craved, would be the lure. The first was always a mirage. The ship was now a weapon, armed and waiting for my command. The core's wail began to climb, a low thrum building into a high-pitched, resonant scream that vibrated through the deck. It was a sound of immense power being intentionally unleashed, a countdown timer to my own obliteration. On the console, a single timer began to tick down from 60 seconds. The window was small. I had 1 minute to set the stage for the final act. Now for the hard part, the acting. The entity in my mind quieted, its chorus of voices turning from triumphant command to confused whispers. It could feel my intent shift, feel the raw power building in the heart of my little ship. It could not read the specifics of my plan, but it could taste the defiance. I had to extinguish it. I had to make it believe I had broken. I let my shoulder slump, letting a wave of manufactured despair wash over me. I projected it outwards, turning my own mind into a beacon of surrender. Every ounce of my willpower went into crafting the illusion of a defeated man. I focused on the years of loneliness, the empty runs, the sterile chimes, the taste of stale coffee. I let the entity see it all, taste the bitter dregs of my solitary existence. I let it feel my weariness, my hopelessness. You're right, I thought, aiming the feeling like a spear into the darkness. I'm so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being alone. You win. Let it be over. The response was immediate. The confused whispers in my head coalesced back into the single, vast consciousness, and it flooded my mind with a feeling of triumphant, ravenous joy. It was a wave of pure, predatory ecstasy. It had won. The morsel was finally ready to be swallowed. Yes, Elias, it purred, the sound resonating through me, a symphony of blissful annihilation. Let go. The song is waiting. Come to the door. We are so very hungry. Its non-physical presence, which had felt like a watchful eye, now pressed in on the ship. I could feel it, a psychic weight against the hull, an eager pressure testing the seals, waiting for the breach. The ship groaned under the strain, not from any physical force, but from the sheer focused intent of the cosmic horror outside. It wanted in. I pushed myself to my feet, my movements deliberately slow, sluggish, the walk of a man on his way to the gallows. Every step toward the airlock was a lie. My mind was a shard of ice, a point of pure crystalline focus in the hurricane of the entity's glee and the rising scream of the overloading core. It wanted in. I pushed myself to my feet, my movements deliberately slow, sluggish, the walk of a man on his way to the gallows. Every step toward the airlock was a lie. My mind was a shard of ice, a point of pure crystalline focus in the hurricane of the entity's glee and the rising scream of the overloading core. 30 seconds. I reached the outer airlock control panel. Two large, illuminated buttons sat side by side. The left, labeled Exterior Door Cycle. The right, a blank, unlabeled button I had rigged myself, the manual trigger for the core detonation. My hand rose, trembling, not from fear, but from the strain of suppressed adrenaline. The chorus in my head was a crescendo of anticipation. They were singing my name now, weaving it into their awful, beautiful song of completion. The pressure on the hull was immense, a palpable sense of a predator coiled to strike the moment the cage door opened. 10 seconds. I let my fingers graze the cool metal of the panel. I looked through the small, reinforced porthole in the airlock door, out into the rippling, hungry blackness. It was waiting. My entire being was now the lure. My body, my ship, my imminent death. A perfectly constructed piece of bait. I took one last shuddering breath of the thick, recycled air, closed my eyes, and offered up my final silent thought. Come and get me. The chorus reached its zenith, a thunderous symphony of psychic welcome that threatened to tear my consciousness apart before the core even had a chance. The pressure against the ship was no longer a gentle push. It was a physical, crushing weight, the void itself straining to break through the thin skin of the hull and claim me. Time seemed to dilate, each of the final few seconds stretching into a lifetime. With a final, silent roar of defiance, my act of surrender was over. My hand, no longer trembling, slammed down, not on one button, but on both. I hit the airlock control and the core trigger in the exact same violent instant. The world dissolved into a chaos of competing sensations. A deafening clang echoed through the ship as the magnetic locks on the outer airlock door disengaged. The scream of the overloading core pitched impossibly higher, a razor-thin shriek that was the sound of physics being torn asunder. Then the void came for me. There was no rush of air, no explosive decompression like in the old movies. It was simply an erasure. The atmosphere in the cockpit vanished instantly, pulled into the absolute vacuum. The pressure change was a physical blow, a silent thunderclap that felt like it would implode my skull. The last bit of air was ripped from my lungs in a painful gasp. My eardrums ruptured. A profound cold, the true cold of interstellar space, bit into my exposed skin. And I felt the entity. It poured into the ship, not as a physical creature, but as a wave of pure consciousness, a tsunami of ancient alien thought. It flooded over me, a sensation of being seen from a million angles at once, of being known down to my last atom. It was the absolute, all-consuming intimacy it had promised, and it was utterly horrific. The joyous chorus became a singular, deafening roar of triumph as it closed in to devour my mind. But I had hit the other button. At the exact moment the entity touched my consciousness, the microfusion core detonated. There was no sound, for there was no air to carry it. There was only light, a silent, impossible flash of pure white creation. The entire world inside the drifter became a star. From my position by the airlock, for a single, silent, eternal microsecond, I was granted a glimpse of the impossible. I saw the entity's presence, the thing made of thought and hunger, recoil. I saw the ripple in space, the tear in reality, where it lived, illuminated from within by my suicidal act of spite. It was not a creature of flesh, but a glorious, terrible lacuna in the fabric of the universe, a wound in the shape of a predator. Then, the heart of my man-made star consumed it. The wave of energy hit me, and my world ceased to exist. Pain was a concept for a reality that no longer applied. I saw everything and nothing. I was a component of a brief, furious sun. My body and mind unraveled into their constituent particles of matter and memory. The chorus of 1,000,000 damned souls was silenced by a fire far brighter than any hell they could imagine. I was giving the entity exactly what it wanted: union, completion. But I was doing it with fire, not surrender. I would not just join its song. I would be the chord that ended the symphony forever. My ship, my prison, my tomb, and my weapon fulfilled its final purpose. I was feeding a star, and the star was feeding on a god. Awareness returned, not as a gentle dawn, but as a fractured, agonizing flicker. It was a mosaic of disconnected sensations. Pain, a deep, searing fire that seemed to inhabit every cell of my body. Cold, a profound, invasive chill that went beyond skin and deep into my bones. And a sound, a thin, rhythmic hissing, desperately close to my ear. My eyes fluttered open. The universe was a smear of light and shadow, my vision swimming. I was floating, adrift, tangled in a grotesque sculpture of blackened, twisted metal, the unrecognizable guts of the stardust drifter. The blast, in its final act of annihilating the ship, must have thrown me clear of the epicenter. My EVA suit, which I'd pulled on in the moments before the end, was a wreck. The helmet's faceplate was a spiderweb of cracks, and red warnings flashed across the fragmented heads-up display. Hull breach. Oxygen leak detected. Auto seal engaged. The hissing. It was my suit's emergency repair system, patching a dozen micro-punctures with sealant foam. The hissing was the sound of my emergency oxygen supply, my last few minutes of life, venting slowly into the void. I forced my head to turn, my muscles screaming in protest. The view was wrong. The patch of space that had held the rippling darkness, the psychic wound, was now clean, scoured. There was no distortion, no unnatural blackness. There was nothing. And the voices, the chorus in my head was gone. The immense, oppressive weight of the entity's consciousness had vanished. I had won. The realization brought no triumph, no elation, only a vast, hollow emptiness that mirrored the space around me. The wreckage of my ferry floated silently, a testament to my victory. It was a graveyard of my own making, and I was its sole inhabitant. But the silence was what truly terrified me. It wasn't the silence of a dead ship or the sanctuary of the Psi Shield. This was a primordial silence, an absolute zero of sound and thought. It was the silence of a universe that was utterly, completely, and indifferently empty. The entity had been a monster, a thing of horrifying hunger, but it had also been a presence. It had filled the void with its malevolence. Now that malevolence was gone, and what was left behind was an absence so profound it felt like a new form of horror. My victory hadn't brought peace. It had simply revealed a deeper, more fundamental truth. I had feared the monster in the dark, but the real horror was the dark itself. Its sterile, eternal, and boundless emptiness. The entity had promised to end my loneliness through union. I had defeated it, and in doing so, I had achieved a state of isolation more absolute than I had ever imagined possible. A flicker of movement caught my eye. A searchlight, a single piercing beam cutting through the debris field. A ship. Rescue. The hissing in my helmet was growing fainter, my vision tunneling to a single point of light. They were coming. They had seen the flash, the birth and death of my tiny, angry star. I was being saved. I was going back to the world of the living, to the teeming habitats and the noise of humanity. But as the rescue ship grew closer, its silhouette a promise of survival, I felt a new and terrible dread, because I knew, with a certainty that froze my soul, that I could never truly leave this silence behind. I had stared into the absolute nothingness between the stars, and it had stared back. And when it had found nothing there, not even a monster, it had imprinted itself upon me. The deafening quiet of the true void was now a part of me, a vacuum in my own soul. The car was not a random car. It was a target. The infirmary was a universe of sterile white. The hum of the medical monitors was a constant, low drone. The measured beeps of my own vital signs were a clock ticking away the seconds of my survival. People came and went. Doctors with sympathetic eyes, corporate investigators with sharp, probing questions, therapists with soft voices and useless platitudes. They spoke to me. They treated the horrific burns that networked my body. They offered me comfort. Their presence was like noise heard through thick glass, audible but distant, lacking any real impact. The company of others, the very thing I had once craved in my quietest moments, now felt hollow. The chatter of nurses, the cadence of questions, it was all just surface texture. It couldn't penetrate the profound silence that had taken root inside me since the blast. I'd answer their questions with rehearsed calm, describing a freak drive core accident. I left out the whispers, the ripple in space, the chorus of the damned. How could I explain it? How could I describe a battle fought against a concept? They would have called it hypoxia-induced psychosis, a symptom of my trauma, and locked me away in a different kind of white room. They called me a hero, a miracle, the sole survivor of a catastrophic accident. They didn't understand that the man named Elias Thorne had died in that fiery detonation. The thing they had pulled from the wreckage was just an echo, a shell shaped around a core of absolute zero. The worst moments were when they left me alone. In the loneliness I had once known so well, there had always been the hum of the ship, the predictable rhythm of my solitary life. Now, being alone was unbearable. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was the other silence, the sterile, perfect, absolute silence of the void I had carried back with me. When the room was quiet, I could feel it, a cold spot in the center of my being, a pocket of the vast, indifferent emptiness of the cosmos. I would spend hours just staring out the infirmary's viewport. It looked out over the sprawling, brilliant lattice of Habitat Epsilon 9, a triumph of human engineering, a hive of millions of souls, buzzing with light and purpose. But I didn't see wonder. I didn't see home. I saw a fragile bubble of warmth suspended over an infinite, cold abyss. My gaze would drift past the glowing city, out into the deep black between the sphere's distant walls. I looked at it not with the practiced boredom of a pilot, but with a deep, instinctual dread. My gaze was forever drawn to the dark places, the little patches of nothing between the artificial stars, because I knew what was really out there. Not a monster, not a god, but an absence so complete that it was a thing in itself, a hunger made of emptiness. I had killed one manifestation of it, one spider in one corner of the web. But the web itself, the sheer, boundless loneliness of the universe, was eternal. I had won. I had survived. I was safe. But I was forever changed. I had looked into the heart of the void and made it scream. And now, a piece of its silent, terrible hunger lived inside of me. A permanent echo in the soul, a reminder that the greatest horror in the universe is not what you find in the darkness, but the realization that the darkness is all there is.